Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Healing Healthcare, Mindful Healthcare Summit. It's a pleasure to be with you today and very exciting to be with our two guests, Perry Gee and Marla Weston, who are with us today to talk about the stresses, the epidemic of burnout in particularly the nursing profession, and how it's evolved and ways in which nurses and people who employ nurses can help um, honor this very important profession and take care of people doing the very difficult work that nurses do in a way that maintains their health and their well-being. Welcome, Perry and Marla. It's great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Marla, maybe you could, because you're a scholar of all of this, actually, it probably makes a good idea. It's probably a better idea for me to introduce both of you before we actually plow into the conversation. Um, uh, Perry is a nurse scientist, a, a well-known authority in the field of nursing. His principal job right now is as the nurse scientist for Intermountain Healthcare in Salt Lake City. He has a doctorate in nursing science and healthcare leadership from the University of California and a master's degree in clinical informatics from the University of Utah. So he's a nurse scientist and a nurse and a scientist. And Marla Weston, who's the CEO of Weston Consulting, has dedicated her career to improving the professional practice environment for nurses and the quality of care for patients. She served as a nurse executive in hospitals, the government, and associations, and served as the CEO of the American Nurses Association enterprise. Her leadership really transformed that organization into one of the fastest growing nonprofits in healthcare. Both of these people, we were excited to be able to talk with them because they've both been recognized advocates for nurses and have spent years working specifically on improving well-being for nurses and, through their writing, through their speaking, and through their professional engagements. Marla, can you set the stage for us? What's the profession of nursing like today? What are some of the events in recent years that have changed it for the better or for worse? And what's the predicament today that nurses are in?
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for setting the stage with that question. One of the things that Perry and I both talk about and remind people about is that even prior to the pandemic, data showed that about a third of nurses were already burnout.
Mm.
So I'm sure over the last 2 years, you've heard a lot about nurses being burnout, but what we need to remember is just the baseline situation that nurses were working in was not fostering the best in their practice. A third of nurses were burnout. About 20% of nurses working in intensive care units and in emergency departments had signs of post-traumatic stress. So we were already starting out in a problematic place. Some of that burnout and stress comes from the nature of the work. When you're dealing in healthcare, particularly when you're dealing with emergency room or intensive care unit patients, you're seeing people in awful situations, horrific accidents, lifelong injuries, horrible situations. And so that alone is sort of a burden to bear, and part of what causes some ongoing stress for nurses. But what was layered on top of that was avoidable and controllable factors. The electronic health record added another burden of work to nurses and wasn't really designed in a way that was facilitating their work in most circumstances. Organizational structures and bureaucracies often didn't value the nurse and didn't create an organizational structure that really brought the best out in their practice. So there were already problems to begin with. The other thing that I like to remind people about is that still today, about 90% of nurses are women. And so they carry, this hefty dual burden that we talk about that women carry in society, often needing to carry childcare responsibilities or elder care responsibilities in their home. So there's a lot of pressures that nurses are operating under just to begin with. Certainly the pandemic amplified and exacerbated what was already going on. Just even to remind people back to the start of the pandemic when we didn't understand a lot about this virus, um, you know, some nurses were furloughed and laid off and carried the financial, sort of stressor of being suddenly unemployed. While other nurses were suddenly taking care of people that we didn't know a lot about. The rules were changing. There was insufficient personal protective equipment. We navigated through that surge, and I think we all thought life would go back to normal. And then, as we all know, we've had these repeated surges. Today, nurses have lived through everything that has gone on with the pandemic. Their children needing to be homeschooled, the debates that have gone on in our society about masking and vaccination. And so now, as we're seeing this incredible surge, the system is really burdened by nurses and other healthcare providers who are just worn out from the pandemic and everything that's happened. They're seeing people flood into their hospitals that didn't take advantage of the vaccine that was available. And so that's a whole different kind of stressor for them. And many of their colleagues are sick. As we're seeing so many people be affected by this latest variant, we have to understand that the healthcare employees are being affected. And it's not just nurses, but it's everyone from the housekeeping staff to the medical records department. And so the whole infrastructure that supports the nurse delivering care to his or her patient is really eroded right now.
One of the things you referred to several times, Marla, is the fact that the system, the society, the institutional cultures project a kind of disrespect toward nurses in a number of ways. Is that lack of esteem a factor in the psychological well-being of nurses on the whole?
I would say in some situations it is, right? In healthcare, one of the things that we see is that there's a continuum of workplaces that highly regard and respect nurses and create a structure that brings out the best in their practice, to others that do not. And so just like in any industry, we have this range.
And when you refer to something like the dialogue in the society at large around masking and vaccination and whether the science can be trusted, is there a psychological impact for medical professionals like nurses when that conversation is carried on in the public sphere?
Yeah, I think it is. And, Perry and I have talked a bit about, and he can even share some examples about this. When part of what's happening is you're a nurse caring for a person who has this infectious disease, and you're putting yourself at risk and your family at risk. And you're caring for someone who could have taken some steps to protect themselves. That is a whole different circumstance for a nurse to work in than they've ever worked in before. we've always taken care of people who maybe didn't do the best in taking care of their own health, but we haven't taken care of people who didn't do the best at taking care of their own health that put our families at risk.
Mm,
And that extra layer of burden and responsibility, I think, weighs heavily on a lot of nurses.
mm. Perry, are there efforts to address this wide, this broad spectrum of stressful circumstances that have put nurses under such strain?
Yeah, yes, Brian, thank you for asking that question because this is really an important thing. The efforts have never been bigger. So Marla talked a little bit about burnout, and frankly, like she said, we've always had this sort of underlying base level of burnout. But what hasn't been done is we haven't been able to talk about it. In fact, I've been to conferences related to caregiver well-being where they said, you know what, we kind of have to keep this to ourselves. Well, now we can talk about the problem, which has been great news. And the other thing is that resources at healthcare companies like my company have been shifted to help with caregiver well-being. Caregiver well-being, which was always important. I don't want people to think it wasn't important to us as a company, but was always important, is now one of the goals that we have in place. And it's not just my company, it's companies all over the country. It's a goal now, caregiver well-being. The National Academy of Medicine, it's the largest initiative they have ever launched. And by the way, they launched that initiative prior to the pandemic. So I see companies doing this. I hear it, I see it every single day. I watch the resources. We have recently hired people whose whole job is caregiver well-being. And so I really do see us as an industry recognizing that this is a problem, also recognizing that this is not a problem that we can solve today. As Marla was mentioning, people already came with a baseline of PTSD. We don't know about other clinicians like respiratory therapists and physicians and PTSD, but we know about nurses. And we know that pandemics, and this is from the research, pandemics have made that worse in the past. So we're going to have to be prepared for that with services ready to intervene if caregivers need that. And by the way, we need to be more proactive in how we screen for that. So we're already beginning those processes at my company and at other companies around the country as well. So I'm really kind of proud of how the industry has taken this on as a real issue, and they know that it will impact everyone's healthcare in the long run.
Yeah, and I just
So,
want to sort of, underline one of the points that Perry was making. I think part of what the pandemic has done is it has normalized the ability for clinicians to talk about how they're doing. If you remember at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of clapping and celebrating nurses and physicians and other healthcare givers as heroes. And one of the things that that clinicians kept saying to us is, we're just human beings, right? We're not heroes, we're just human beings. And I think this pandemic has allowed people the ability to talk openly with their colleagues about what it's like and how delivering healthcare, both in this setting, but just in general, affects their well-being. It's made it okay to say that I'm not okay.
mm, yeah,
That may be the biggest gift that we get.
yeah, that is kind of a breakthrough, isn't it? And not just in healthcare, probably.
Mhm, mhm.
So, Perry, you say that you're screening for PTSD. Do you mean the workforce as a whole, or the nursing workforce as a whole, or only at hiring?
You know what? We're actually wanting to screen caregivers in the workforce as a whole, because I can tell you, it has really impacted nurses and physicians and respiratory therapists in the front line. but it's also impacted people working in environmental services and in security and in the back office as well. And so we really need to look at everyone. Now that's tough because we don't have resources. We have over 40,000 caregivers in my company, for example. We don't have the resources to evaluate 40,000 people today. And then, so we evaluate them, and even if only a small fraction have issues, how are we going to treat that group of people? Our mental health services in our state anyway are right now really at capacity. How are we going to treat an additional several thousand people that come from what we find out? So we're working on that. We have a kind of a layered approach to how we're doing the screen. Number one, we're starting with peers. That's where it's got to start. It's got to start at the unit level with peers and saying, you know what, how are you doing today? Those are the questions that we're asking. How are you doing today? And if people are not doing well, then we're actually training in a peer support program for people to say, hey, you know what? Here are some potential resources, starting with EAP services. And so something as simple as EAP, who are counselors.
That's the employee assistance programs. That's what you're
employee assistance program. That's correct. And they are poised. Now, keep in mind, the employee assistance program was not, set up to handle a pandemic either. And so they are going to have to figure out how can we prioritize our needs. So we're starting with some of our high intensity units, like Marla discussed, the emergency departments and the intensive care units. We're starting with them. We're actually reaching out to people, to caregivers. EAP people are reaching out and saying, hey, could I call you and just talk to you for a few minutes and see how you're doing?
As a routine.
And that's not something we've done in the past. We haven't been reaching out. People have been coming to us. We're proactively reaching out now. And part of the things that the EAP people do is they do a screening, a real brief evidence-based screening for PTSD. Now, if there's a problem that arises and it's outside the scope of an EAP person, then we engage behavioral health services. Mm-hmm. But again, like I mentioned, that we've got to be really careful that we are able to provide service. So we identify somebody who might need help. Now we need to be able to react right away.
Wow, lots of innovation and new ideas coming to bear. Marla, in the scope of your work, do you have some other favorite responses to the burnout issue across the nursing profession that seem like good ideas that ought to be implemented more widely?
Yeah, I think a lot of it really centers around letting people know that it's okay not to be okay, and where to get access to services if they feel like they need to talk. I was just here learning the other day about an organization that has put signs up kind of on the way to people's cars at the end of the shift. So at the end of the shift, they have signs up, kind of reminding them to leave work at work and take a deep breath and let it go. And if they feel like they want to talk to someone, here's a number that they can call. So, putting those kind of markers in place to sort of debrief from work and move into a different space. And if you need more help, here's who you can call. So I thought that was a really creative and innovative solution. Yeah. There's a lot of organizations now that are putting signs up in their emergency departments, in their units, really talking about, we're creating a healing environment here. It's an environment of respect and what the expected behaviors are. And, part of that is because we have seen issues where people visiting family have been really rude to nurses and disrespectful, even violent. And so, really putting signs up that say, this is a healing environment, here are the behaviors that we expect. A lot of people are putting in the peer-to-peer support programs that Perry mentioned. And, that's one of the best ways to address this. One of the things that nurses and other health caregivers lost in the pandemic is that, kind of hanging out together after work,
Yeah.
or, getting together for everything from baby showers to celebrating birthdays, right? The collegial stuff that we all used to do at work. And so, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, people lost that. So there wasn't this opportunity to talk about what you were experiencing in debriefing. And so people are putting lots of initiatives in place around creating those conversations. One of the things I think that we've begun to understand as part of this work is that the onus cannot be on the individual entirely for addressing this, but the organization has to create a culture that supports well-being. So lots of people also are creating mindful moments. At the end of shift report, they'll take a minute and just have a mindful moment. Sometimes at the end of their workday, they'll stop and take a few minutes to debrief together. So normalizing those practices that cause us all to just stop and center ourselves.
So describe a mindful moment for me. What in the context of a healthcare organization, is it 60 seconds of silence? What is it?
Yeah, it can be 60 seconds of silence. It can be listening to a 3-minute meditation together. Lots of people have created a corner or a room or a place where on your break you can go and just be alone, and they'll have dim lighting and a comfortable chair and maybe some meditation tapes or something like that. So anything to just get us all to stop and center ourselves, take a deep breath.
You said that some healthcare organizations are providing patients or patient families with some guidelines around respecting nurses and how to treat the healthcare professionals. Are physicians trained differently today than they were in years past in terms of their demeanor around nurses, and has the nurse physician relationship changed over time?
Yeah, I think it has changed. The kinds of historical behaviors that we heard about of disrespect, throwing instruments in an operating room, those things just would not be tolerated anymore. And so I think that that culture is changing. What I would say is that for a lot of caregivers on the front lines of the pandemic, what they have experienced in a lot of practice settings is a real sense of collegiality with the team that they work with.
Yeah.
I was talking with a group of nurses the other day, and probably the people they trust the most and are telling the most about their experience is the people that they actually work with: physicians,
Sure.
nurses, respiratory therapists together.
Yeah.
And I think when we can create those kinds of teams and that kind of teamwork, it really is very supportive of everyone working together.
Perry, is a feeling of being valuable, of being valued, a factor in burnout, a factor in well-being in the workplace, but in healthcare or anywhere else?
That is such a great question, Brian. And yes, it is. In fact, it's so important that the company that we use and that other companies use to measure how employee engagement is doing measures specifically that. They look at that issue and make sure that it's dealt with, that people's voices are heard, that people feel valued. I hear it all the time from nurses. It's one of those things that we always have to be keeping track of. Yes, they felt valued through this pandemic, but like Marla said, that over time has kind of changed. So we started the pandemic with signs in our front yard And now, as we've been into the pandemic for 2 or 3 years, we're seeing people being attacked at work. So we've really come a long ways, and people are almost afraid to talk about science, even, which is pretty frightening, in the middle of all this, because there's so much uncertainty. People have lost some trust in our teams, not by anybody's fault, especially on our team, but they certainly have lost some trust. And we've had the luxury of being the most trusted profession for the last at least 15 years. We want to maintain that. We have not changed. In fact, we've been more resolved during this pandemic than any other time. We're more dedicated to our patients and our communities than we probably ever have been. We've risked our lives for them.
Yeah.
And so that's been tough. But that notion of being valued is something that's very important to us in nursing and very important to us in healthcare. And that's why we measure that among all of our caregivers.
Yeah, we have a good colleague named Leslie Kelly who's done quite a bit of research around meaningful recognition for nurses and how meaningful recognition is protective from burnout. And what she means by meaningful recognition is not just somebody going by at the end of the day going, nice job, but it is specific feedback about something that you have done in a way that really acknowledges your contribution. And one of the things that anyone can embed in their organization as part of their organizational culture is a way of giving meaningful recognition. We know that gratitude is very protective for people's well-being, and we've done a lot of work in building gratitude into organizations and into practices. And so, even nurses journaling about what they're grateful for, having moments of gratitude and teaching people what expressing gratitude is really all about. It's about authentic gratefulness. You can't be grateful that you have more patients than what you can handle today, but you can be grateful that you're working with your colleague Perry, who is a very competent nurse. And so helping people to find those moments of gratitude in the midst of all this chaos.
A lot of this feels to me like an exercise in a broad way of compassion. Is compassion an ingredient in the evolution of our understanding of the evolution of the healthcare industry? Perry, do you think?
Yes, it really does. And just a quick follow-up on something that Marla just said. So she talked about gratitude and the importance of that. Like all these other issues that we're describing, gratitude is another area that now has come to the surface. Everybody recognizes how important it is for our well-being. Mindfulness is being recognized as important for our well-being. We've got more and more people in our company trying mindfulness every single day. It's become an important offering that we've had. Compassion is another one of those areas, and compassion, I was surprised to find out. I was a researcher several years ago, and my CEO asked me, can you do research in compassion? I had no idea. Number one, I didn't realize that compassion was something that we could enhance. I thought it was something that we just sort of had innately. I learned through the literature that you can. In fact, there's whole centers devoted to it. Stanford has the Center for Compassion Research, Altruism, and Education, where they focus on that. And compassion is so important, and especially now. And let's talk about the connection between compassion and mindfulness. So, there's three different kinds of compassion: the compassion that we give. And of course, we in healthcare are experts at giving compassion. We do that every day. We give it all the time. Compassion that we receive from others, we're less good about that, right? Oh, it's no big deal. Oh, this is my job. We don't receive compassion super well. And then compassion to ourselves. And that's one of the really tough things. And let me give you a quick example of that. I was speaking to a nurse who works in the operating room the other day, and she was telling me that she was in the middle of a difficult case. She was scrubbed in with the surgeon. She made a serious error. The error, didn't, by the way, did not harm the patient, but what it did was it slowed the case down and cost some extra money for the facility. And she said that the physician was a little angry with her, but didn't really say anything, just sort of kind of gave her a look. The anesthesiologist was frustrated with her. But more than anything, she said, I had 2 more hours in that case where I had to face that surgeon. And she said, I spent the entire 2 hours beating myself up, telling myself that I was a failure, that I was a terrible nurse, I was a terrible person. And she said, why did I do that? She said, I really hurt myself. She said, I was exhausted after that case. I didn't need to do that. I could have forgiven myself. It's that inner voice. And so that's what I want to mention about compassion. And that is that self-compassion notion, or the notion of that inner voice that we need to, especially during times like this, need to mindfully harness that voice. When we are going over and over and saying, you know, oh, you're so stupid. Why do you make these kind of errors? Those kinds of things. We need to stop ourselves. We need to have a clue to stop yourself. I wear a little bracelet on my wrist that reminds me that if I'm starting to think negatively, I need to stop it. And I usually smile to myself and then move on. Sometimes you might have to take a couple deep breaths, try to kind of become mindful for just a moment. Stop that negative thinking in your head. We have to do that now, because that's part of this equation as we get ourselves out of burnout, as we get ourselves out of this pandemic. But if you spend 2 hours beating yourself up in your own head, you're not going to be able to serve that patient. You're not going to be able to serve the system that you work for, or certainly not going to be able to serve yourself. So that kind of compassion is so important. And then one more notion about compassion. I talked about how much compassion we pour out to others, and that's great. During the pandemic, in addition to burnout, we've experienced a lot of compassion fatigue. We've just worn out. I've been giving and giving and giving. I've been doing some research in the units where we take care of the COVID patients, and it's primarily with patients who are on a respirator, mechanical ventilation. And the nurses feel like they just never get ahead. They feel like they never make a difference in these patients' lives. They feel very frustrated. And they're pouring out compassion all day, every day, not only to the patient, but to the family and to their fellow nurses. And so they go home and they have what we call compassion fatigue. That's a scientific construct that we can actually measure. There's an instrument that measures compassion fatigue. But there's another kind of a superpower that we have as healthcare providers, and that superpower is compassion satisfaction. Again, another construct that we can measure. And with compassion satisfaction, we can, I'm sorry, I thought I had my phone on silent. With compassion satisfaction, what we can do is we build our compassion back up. We re-energize ourselves. Think of that time when you've really been compassionate to another human being, how that's made you feel inside, how satisfying that's been. Well, that's exactly what we can do, what we do as healthcare providers, and we're really good at it. So we really should nurture that. Take more time to be compassionate. Be as compassionate as you can be to patients and families and fellow workers. Be compassionate to the security guard when you're going home today from work. Stop and say, how thankful you are that that person is there and how they make you feel safe. Pour that compassion out. That's compassion satisfaction will take care of some of this compassion fatigue.
So just to clarify, you're suggesting that the recognition of the value of your compassion, the recognition that you've been of benefit, is actually an antidote for the fatigue that can come from simply exercising compassion toward a lot of people over a long period of time. It's the awareness that you're being of benefit, maybe.
That's right. It's that awareness and that feeling that we get, and that energizes us, re-energizes us again. Because normally, we have compassion fatigue. The nice thing about it is typically you go home, you get a decent night's rest, you get up, you go back to work, and you do a great job offering compassion to others again. But when you're in the middle of something like this pandemic that just does not seem to end, and you've just been pouring yourself out every single day, that's when it's hard to keep that yourself re-energized. Now, if you're burned out on top of that, and you feel some cynicism and exhaustion, you know what? Maybe I won't go that extra mile to offer compassion to my person. Then all of a sudden, you get yourself into a vicious cycle. And that's where we start to see people get into trouble.
Yeah. Marla, does it ever feel to you like we're operating in a world that's less compassionate than it might have been in the past?
I think we all are feeling like we're operating in a world that is less compassionate than it's been in the past. And, we see lots of evidence of that, even just reading the news or talking with neighbors. And, the only solution that we all know that we can do is person to person and neighbor to neighbor and friend to friend, and being kind to the person that is working in the grocery store, and being appreciative of the person who drove the truck that brought the groceries to the grocery store, and really thinking through that and generating that space of gratefulness and appreciation.
Hmm. Do you feel that, Perry?
Yes, definitely do. And I feel it now, more than ever. I think this needs to be an area where we stay focused.
Amen. This has been a fascinating conversation for me. What topics around the subject of burnout and nurses have we not addressed so far in this conversation that you all feel are important? What have we missed?
I think the one thing that I would just say is, so often we talk about the antidote to burnout being resilience. And I think people get confused about what resilience is. They confuse resilience with endurance.
Hmm.
This idea of, being tough and being strong and keeping going. And what we need to understand is that resilience is a lot about allowing yourself to step away. It is that self-compassion, it is that kindness, it is that rejuvenation, and doing that in small moments throughout the day, and doing that in big moments, making sure that when you have a day off, you are doing something to re-energize yourself, whatever that is, right? Whatever that is.
That's a great point. What about you, Perry?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up resilience, Marla, because that certainly has become the buzzword, of course, over the last couple of years. And I know there's a connection between mindfulness and resilience, I believe. There's so in this model resilience that we've been developing over the last few years, we think that the sense of purpose is one of those factors that impacts resilience. We think that a sense of control over one's own practice is another factor. And last, we really think that connections with others is the most important thing. And so I would say that today, those connections with others, which have been strained for this pandemic, are the most important factor that we could really focus on. That's why we talked so much earlier about peer support. I think we need to check in on each other. We need to take an extra step to check in on each other. You know what? I haven't seen the nurse Sally that I worked with, all day. I haven't seen her for hours now. I wonder what's going on with her. Is she stuck in a room? Is she getting her work done? Is she doing okay? We really need to check in on one another, make sure people are okay, and go beyond what we've done in the past, because this is a different time.
Indeed, it is. Well, it's gratifying to have met the two of you and to get a sense of the work you're doing on behalf of, nurses immediately, and then patients and the healthcare industry and all of us ultimately. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and for the work you do. And thanks everybody out there for joining us. I'm Brian Welch, and we at Mindful are very proud and happy and gratified to share information like this with all of you.